Imagine this: a hand resting against the rough flank of an ancient acacia tree, not searching for anything shaped, sharpened, or crafted, but simply holding the bark for balance in a world that did not yet expect hands to do anything more complex than keep a body upright or steady a cautious climb. Picture that moment before intention travelled down the arm, a time when fingers knew branches better than objects, when touch was built for survival rather than manipulation. Before tools, the hand of an early hominin was an instrument tuned to an environment of bark, soil, stone, grass stems, and the weight of its owner's own body. Every surface carried information. Every contact was a negotiation with gravity, texture, and heat. The pre-tool hand lived in a world measured by pressure and friction, not edges and leverage. We do not know for certain what an australopith first felt each morning, but the evidence suggests that much of their day involved navigating uneven ground, climbing still useful trees, and gripping vegetation that offered both support and hazard. The hands they carried were not yet the hands we know. Their fingers were still slightly curved, shaped by generations of gripping branches during ascent and descent. Their joints bore the imprint of regular loading in positions that modern human hands rarely adopt. Their thumbs, though more robust than those of other primates, were not yet ready for the full demands of precision pinching. Instead, the hand operated as a whole, spreading load across multiple digits rather than concentrating force at a tip. The world responded to this hand not with subtle resistance, as stone later would, but with pliant surfaces, bark that gave slightly under pressure, grasses that bent without breaking, soil that shifted beneath the heel of the palm. Reconstructing this world requires attention to the microforces that bones record silently. Australopith hand fossils show evidence of powerful flexor muscles, useful for holding onto irregular surfaces with sustained tension. They also show limited development of the broadened distal phalanges that characterize later toolmakers. This suggests a life where grasping meant embracing the form of the world rather than shaping it. When climbing, the hand acted like a living hook, distributing weight along multiple finger bones. When foraging, it plucked fruit with whole hand grips, stabilizing branches with the other arm. When moving across varied terrain, it occasionally met the earth in a posture similar to knuckle-based support. Not quite like the knuckle walking of earlier ancestors, but still far from the precision freedom of later hominins. The tactile world of these beings was filled with sensations rarely discussed in narratives of human origins. The vibration that travels through a branch when another animal shifts above, the way dry grass cuts faint lines across the skin of the palm, the warmth stored in a rock after a day of sun, the small abrasions caused by repeated encounters with thorny vegetation. The hand learned from each of these encounters. It built a sensory vocabulary long before it built a tool. The fingertips, though not yet refined for the highest acuity, already housed dense receptor fields capable of distinguishing subtle changes in texture. This allowed early hominins to judge which branch could bear weight, which fruit was ripe, and which surface might crumble beneath pressure. We do not yet see in these hands the bone remodeling that comes from repeated tool gripping. Instead, we see something quieter, a structure optimized for both terrestrial locomotion and arboreal fallback. Wrist bones show ranges of motion that allowed for stability during climbing and flexibility during foraging. Carpals sat in arrangements that favored mobility over precision. Ligaments anchored a system designed for immediate reactive interactions with the environment. If a predator approached, the hands were ready not to strike, but to pull the body quickly toward the safety of a branch, or to brace for rapid directional changes. Touch was not about control, it was about awareness. In paleoanthropological terms, australopith hands occupy a transitional space between life in trees and life on open ground. They retain enough curvature to allow for efficient climbing, but begin to show the early shift toward manipulative potential. Yet it is essential to remember that this potential was unused. The hand may have contained the structural hints of future dexterity, but without tools it had no opportunity to refine those capacities. The environmental demands placed on it were immediate and sensory. Leaves, bark, soil and stone were encountered not as materials to be shaped, but as surfaces to be understood. Even stone itself, so central in later human stories, entered their world as something to be stepped on, sat near, or used occasionally to crack nuts in simple percussive acts that did not yet reshape the stone or the hand. Archaeological evidence from this time tells us nothing about deliberate modification of objects. The hands we reconstruct had not yet learned the rhythms that later defined tool making, the preparation grip, the striking angle, the rotational adjustments that shape a flake. Without those repeated motions, the musculature needed for fine force precision remained dormant. What developed instead were powerful grips, broad stabilizing actions and feedback loops optimized for security rather than subtlety. This is why the hand bones from this era show wide heads where muscles attach, signalling force rather than crafted precision. Imagine their evenings, when the day's foraging waned and light thinned over mixed woodland landscapes. Hands that had spent hours grasping branches, probing for edible roots, and steadying gaits across uneven earth would relax around nothing more complex than twigs or the bodies of infants. Their world was not tool-mediated. The hand-to-object interactions they experienced were direct and unintentional. No mental image of shape existed within the palm. No anticipated edge waited to be revealed through the right combination of force and angle. The hand was simply part of a body surviving. The climate of these landscapes likely accentuated the hand's sensory demands. Seasonal shifts between wet and dry conditions changed the tactile properties of nearly every surface. During rainy periods, bark swelled and became more textured. Soils softened and required new stabilizing strategies. Grasses bent under their own weight, complicating foraging routes. During dry seasons, the hand encountered harsher textures, cracked earth, brittle stems, and the abrasive dryness of tree trunks under prolonged sun. Each season shaped the sensory map inscribed in the nervous system, but none demanded the kind of controlled biomechanics that tools later imposed. The revelation that we must carry into this episode is simple. Before tools altered human hands, the world shaped them through contact alone. The anatomy we see in fossils reflects behaviours grounded directly in environmental interaction. The hand was a sensory anchor, a stabiliser, a climber's hook, a forager's probe. It carried information inward, not outward. It solved immediate physical problems, but did not yet externalise solutions into durable objects. From this baseline, researchers gain a clear starting point for understanding how dramatic the later transformation would be. Once tools emerged, the hands of descendants no longer merely interpreted the world, they began shaping it. But in this first moment of the story, we encounter a hand that belonged entirely to nature's rhythm, not to its own crafted order. The transition from arboreal reliance to more terrestrial foraging created new tactile demands that slowly nudged anatomy forward. Earlier hominins may have used simple percussive actions to open nuts, but these interactions lacked the repeated precision necessary to modify bone structure significantly. Australopith wrist bones, for instance, do not yet show the thickening or selective remodelling associated with high-force tool production. Their fingers show no signs of repeated fine-force pinch. Their thumbs, although strong, do not bear the patterns that appear later when gripping narrow stone edges thousands of times across a lifetime. If we try to imagine a day entirely through touch, a different picture emerges from the usual visual reconstructions of early hominin life. The hands brush through foliage, pressed into soft soil to test stability, gripped fibrous plant stalks, and occasionally met cold water when crossing shallow streams. They guided motion rather than creating opportunity. There's a humility in this phase of human evolution. No tool existed to extend the hand's reach or power. The sensory world lived at the scale of the arm's length, and cognition followed accordingly. The world was intimate, tactile, and immediate. This sensory foundation is essential because it reveals what changed when tools appeared. A hand that once only responded began, eventually, to anticipate. A hand that once gripped branches learned to grip force itself, channeling it through stone edges. A hand that once understood bark learned to understand fracture mechanics. But all of this lay far in the future. In this first chapter, the hand is quiet. If we walk backward through time, the pre-tool hominin hand reminds us that innovation was not inevitable. The raw anatomy existed, but its meaning had not yet unfolded. These hands carried no cultural memory, no inherited techniques. Their owners learned from landscapes rather than from objects. In many ways, these hands were the last truly natural hands of our lineage, and it is from this quiet beginning, where touch meant survival but not yet imagination, that the story of human hands begins. And with that starting point, we can finally understand what changed when something sharp entered the world and asked the hand to become something new. And once that invitation appeared, nothing in our anatomy remained untouched. And from this earliest landscape of touch, the first transformations would begin with pressures that shaped not just what hands felt, but what they could become. Alright, hello fellow sapiens, sit back, relax and prepare to step quietly into when tools rewired human hands, the story of the anatomy we built ourselves. Tonight we follow a simple truth that reaches across millions of years. Our hands did not just make tools. Tools made our hands. If you're new here, this is Sleepless Homo, soft science, slow storytelling, and deep time told gently. A place for tired thinkers, night drivers, background learners, and anyone who likes to fall asleep with archaeology whispering in the dark. A moment in deep time when a hand reaches toward a branch, curls around it, and closes with a firmness that feels almost familiar, but not quite. Picture that hand belonging to a hominin who has never shaped a tool, never struck stone on stone, never envisioned the edge that will one day change the species, and yet the hand itself is already carrying something new, something transitional, something that seems to be leaning toward a future it does not yet recognize. What if the earliest chapters of toolmaking were already written in bone long before the first flake fell? We know from the fossil record that the hands of early hominins in the period between 3 million and 2 million years ago were neither fully arboreal nor fully terrestrial, neither committed to climbing nor wholly freed for manipulation. Instead, these hands occupied a narrow biomechanical corridor that offered just enough strength to grip branches securely and just enough dexterity to pick apart tough shells or peel bark from fibrous stems. They were neither the long-fingered hooks of arboreal apes, nor the compact hands of later stoneflakers. They were something in between, showing hints of a future they did not yet inhabit. The revelation that emerges from these bones is that early hominin hands were almost ready for tools, but not entirely. They carried pre-adaptations, shortened fingers, a more forward-facing thumb, a stiffer wrist, that created the possibility of tool-making, but they lacked the full transformation that working stone would eventually demand. What we see in these fossils is not the result of tool use, but the stage that made tool use possible. Fossils attributed to species such as Australopithecus africanus and Australopithecus sediba reveal a consistent pattern. fingers that have begun to shorten relative to those of apes, reducing the mechanical advantage needed for powerful branch gripping, but increasing stability for firmer whole-hand grasps. These shorter digits create a more compact arc in the palm, a shape that distributes force more evenly when gripping hard objects such as nuts, stems, or unmodified stones. We do not know exactly how these hands interacted with their surroundings, but the morphology suggests a shift from predominantly suspensory movements toward more frequent manipulation of terrestrial resources. Imagine a hand that can still climb, but no longer relies upon climbing to survive. A hand that explores the world more often on the ground than in the canopy. A hand that is learning through anatomy that the earth offers things worth holding. The thumb of these early hominins tells an equally important story. While not yet as long relative to the fingers as that of modern humans, the thumb shows increased robustness, particularly in the distal phalanx. This indicates improved capacity for forceful pad-to-side grips, also known as precision power hybrids. Such grips allow an individual to hold an object securely while exerting pressure along one side, an ability that becomes crucial in later stone flaking, but at this stage was more likely used for tasks like peeling bark, breaking apart woody stems, or accessing embedded insects. The angle of rotation at the carpometacarpal joint is also notable. In apes, the thumb often lies parallel to the palm, optimized for powerful hook grips during climbing. In early hominins, the thumb begins to angle slightly outward, increasing opposition potential. It's not yet capable of the fully refined pad-to-pad pinch characteristic of Homo, but it is no longer restricted to arboreal mechanics. This transitional orientation suggests a growing reliance on objects that required controlled pressure and directional force. Underlying these digits is a wrist that begins to stiffen in specific ways. Apes possess flexible wrists adapted for absorbing impact during knuckle walking or climbing. Early hominins display increased bony buttressing on the radial and ulnar sides of the wrist, limiting excessive motion and creating a more stable platform for transmitting force from arm to hand. This change does not necessarily imply toolmaking. Indeed, most researchers agree that these pre-tool hominins did not create or use stone flakes with intention, but it does suggest repeated behaviours that required controlled leverage. Breaking branches, levering stones to uncover tubers, or manipulating tough plant materials could have favoured a wrist that resisted bending under load. In this sense, the wrist acts as a supporting structure, preparing the mechanical foundation that later toolmakers will rely upon. These anatomical changes appear across multiple early hominin species, suggesting a broader ecological shift. As woodlands thinned and more open habitats emerged between 3 million and 2 million years ago, hominins increasingly navigated mixed landscapes. A hand adapted for both climbing and terrestrial foraging offered flexibility. It allowed individuals to access fruits at height when necessary, but also to dig, pry and manipulate objects on the ground. The fossil record of associated postcranial remains supports this view. Lower limbs show adaptations for bipedal walking, while upper limbs retain features that indicate climbing ability. Hominins were experimenting with a new mode of existence, one that blended arboreal remnants with terrestrial innovation. Their hands mirrored this transitional lifestyle. Recent microscopic studies on wear patterns preserved on fossil phalanges show indications of repeated compressive loading at the distal ends of certain fingers, patterns consistent with gripping and twisting motions. These patterns are not diagnostic of tool use, but do illustrate increased reliance on manual force in foraging. They suggest a repertoire of behaviours involving bark stripping, nut cracking, or digging for roots using unmodified stones or wood. Early hominins may have used found objects opportunistically, employing them without reshaping them. This is not toolmaking in the technological sense, but it is an expansion of manual possibilities. These behaviours demand a stronger thumb, a more stable wrist, and fingers capable of resisting torsional stress, exactly the traits we see emerging. Isotopic evidence from teeth supports this picture. Diets of many early hominin species include a mix of tough, fibrous plants and harder-to-access underground storage organs. These foods require substantial processing, often involving peeling, scraping, or pounding. Although we cannot observe the exact motions, the anatomical context strongly suggests that repeated manipulative actions gradually shaped the selective pressures acting on the hand. This is where the notion of pre-adaptation becomes important. Natural selection did not create shorter fingers or a more robust thumb because future generations would one day shape stone. Instead, these traits emerged because they improved immediate survival tasks. The remarkable outcome is that the same traits later made the leap to stone technology feasible. Another line of evidence comes from comparative functional morphology. Studies examining the hand bones of australopith species show a combination of features not present in either modern humans or other apes. This mosaic includes a palm that is narrower than that of apes, but broader than that of later Homo, a thumb that is more opposable than that of chimpanzees, but less so than that of humans, and joints that permit controlled loading, without yet optimizing fine manipulation. Such mosaic patterns often indicate evolutionary compromise. The hand was balancing multiple demands: climbing stability, terrestrial manipulation, and protection against environmental hazards. This balance allowed for a wide behavioural repertoire but limited extreme specialisation. It was a hand ready for many tasks but not yet structured for the full precision and force distribution needed for intentional stone flaking. Archaeological sites associated with these species show no unequivocal stone tools until much later. Yet the ecological contexts, woodland edges, mixed savanna habitats, and riverine foraging zones provide ample opportunities for manual experimentation. Imagine early hominins lifting fallen branches to search for insects, carrying stones to crack marrow-rich bones left by carnivores, or stripping bark to access hidden moisture. These behaviours blur the boundary between pure foraging and proto-technological engagement. They do not reshape the environment through tools, but they reshape how the hand interacts with the environment. With every repetition of these tasks, selective pressures accumulate quietly. The revelation of this segment is that before tools shaped hands, hands were already shaping the possibility of tools. There was no single moment when anatomy suddenly became sufficient for stoneworking. Instead, there was a gradual drift, fingers shortening, thumbs thickening, wrists stabilizing. Each change small, but together creating the framework upon which later technologies would build. The hand that lifted an unmodified stone to break open a nut was anatomically distinct from the hand that would later strike stone intentionally to release a flake. But the first could not have existed without the second. They are chapters in a lineage of form responding to function, and this leads to the realization that the boundary between before tools and with tools is far more porous than we often imagine. Pre-adaptations are not accidents waiting for purpose. They are solutions to present challenges that later become foundations for new behaviours. In the case of early hominins, the hand was responding to ecological pressures, shifting diets, mixed locomotion, resource extraction, and in doing so it became increasingly capable of behaviours it had not yet performed. A hand that peels bark or cracks stems is not a toolmaker, but it is a hand learning to apply force in controlled ways. It is a hand rehearsing unknowingly for a future role. And so the transitional hominin hand stands in our deep past as a structure suspended between two worlds. It is almost enough for tools, but not entirely. It is guided not by technology, but by the terrain itself. Its anatomy is a conversation between environment and bone, between need and capability. It is a hand that is not yet making tools, but is already shaped by the movements that will someday make tool-making possible. And in that slow evolutionary drift, something begins to change that will echo through every chapter of our species. The hand is preparing itself, and this preparation leads us toward the moment when tools no longer waited for anatomy to catch up. And then, shaping the world began to reshape the hand in return, and that reshaping would soon blur the boundary between bone and intention. If you enjoy calm, factual journeys like this, feel free to like or subscribe. Not for numbers, but because it helps other sleepless minds find a quiet corner of the internet. Tell me in the comments how you usually listen. In bed, while working, walking, cooking, or drifting somewhere between awake and gone. And if you fall asleep halfway through, don't worry. The timestamps will wait for you when you return. All right, let's continue, and as always, stay curious, stay calm. Picture a moment when a hand lifts a stone not simply because it is heavy or comforting in its coolness, but because the mind behind that hand is beginning to anticipate what might happen next. Imagine a hominin at the edge of a shaded woodland 3 million years ago, long before language or teaching, or even the clarity of intention. The air holds the smell of damp soil. A kernel of curiosity stirs as the stone shifts weight in the palm, and then, with a movement practiced for reasons the mind cannot yet articulate, the stone strikes another. Something sharper appears. For the first time, an edge enters the world not through accident, but through a faint, quiet precursor of purpose. Archaeology gives us no fossilized thoughts, only fractures that imply them. Longform tools, older than the genus Homo, show the earliest hints of intentionality. Their flakes are large and irregular, their platforms thick, their angles unpredictable, and yet the scars on their surfaces carry signatures of repeated force applied from similar directions. This suggests that the individuals who made them were not simply dropping stones or crushing nuts. They were experimenting through action. They were learning through material resistance. A mind that does this is no longer reacting to the world, but beginning to test it. When we speak of cognition at this early stage, we must be careful. These were not mind-planning sequences several steps ahead. They were not imagining the edge before it existed. But they were beginning to bind perception and action into a loop that could support future planning. The hand that strikes learns something about force. The eye learns something about fracture. The tactile receptors in the skin carry information into neural pathways that will, over many thousands of generations, become the architecture of motor control. The longform hominin does not yet have a plan, but the brain is rehearsing movements that could support one. A simple fracture becomes a lesson. What does it feel like when stone resists? How does force travel through the wrist? What is the relationship between weight and impact? Even without conscious reflection, repeated actions shape synaptic pathways. In modern neuroscience, this is the earliest form of action sequencing, linking one movement to the next through embodied memory rather than conceptual foresight. Repetition strengthens circuits. Successful outcomes, even if not fully understood, are stored. Over generations, such patterns create predispositions. The brain becomes more sensitive to the consequences of impact. At longform, we see the first stage, the sensory motor loop tightening. But at this stage, the loop is immediate and closed. Strike, sound, shard. No anticipation beyond the moment, no mental template, no model of what the stone should become. The transition toward true planning begins with an expansion of attention. In older one contexts around 2,600,000 years ago, flakes appear with more predictable angles, thinner platforms, and repetitive reduction patterns. These features cannot arise without the mind stepping one small step outside of the present. To control a platform angle, one must inhibit impulsive force. To remove flakes consistently, one must attend not only to the strike but to the core as a whole. This is the birth of hierarchical action planning. We know from experimental archaeology that even the simplest older one flake requires selecting a core with the right symmetry, locating a suitable striking platform, positioning it securely, choosing a hammerstone, and striking at a specific angle. These steps occur in seconds, yet each one demands micro-decisions. The mind performing them is no longer surprised when a flake detaches, it expects it. This expectation is the beginning of foresight. Some of the most revealing evidence comes from refitted cores, where archaeologists reassemble flakes to reconstruct the sequence of removals. These reconstructions show patterns, flakes removed in arcs, platforms refreshed after several strikes, angles corrected through targeted blows. Behind these patterns is a mind capable of envisioning an outcome sufficiently stable to guide action. This is not yet abstract thought, but it is intentional modification of matter, guided by internal representation. And that internal representation is the foundation of planning. What changes in the brain when this begins? Comparative neuroscience suggests involvement of regions homologous to the human premotor cortex and posterior parietal cortex. These regions support spatial reasoning, hand-eye coordination, and the prediction of action outcomes. When a hominin prepares to strike a core, neurons in these regions fire even before the muscles contract. The brain is modelling the action internally. Such predictive coding is absent or minimal in species that do not modify objects intentionally. This shift also interacts with mirror neuron systems. If one individual produces a flake and another observes, sensory neurons fire in patterns similar to those activated when performing the action. This mirroring creates a pathway for imitation learning. It allows skills to pass between individuals not through explicit teaching, but through embodied observation. Some of the earliest evidence for this lies in clusters of older one debris, where multiple reduction sequences overlap. This suggests shared learning spaces, multiple individuals experimenting within sight of one another. Skill transmission that does not require language but relies on the shared architecture of perception. For such learning to persist, attention must stabilize. A distracted mind cannot replicate fracture patterns. The stable environments where older one sites are found, often near rivers or raw material sources, likely supported the cognitive shift by reducing external pressures. Safe zones allow experimentation. Experimentation strengthens neural pathways. Neural pathways, once stable, become part of developmental expectations. A child who grows up watching stonework acquires a brain biased toward these circuits. But before these cognitive structures existed, hands had begun the process. The stiffened wrists of earlier hominins create the mechanical stability needed for directed force. The shortened fingers allow better control of weight distribution. Anatomy sets the stage for cognition. Cognition then reshapes anatomy through selective pressure in a feedback loop extending across hundreds of thousands of years. One of the most remarkable implications of the transition from Lomekwi to older one cognition is the emergence of inhibitory control. To create a predictable flake, one must avoid striking from the wrong direction. One must refrain from impulses built from years of other behaviours. Inhibition is a cognitive achievement. It allows the mind to choose among options. It is, in essence, early executive function. the ability to hold back, to modulate force, to direct attention selectively. These traits are steps toward later capacities such as planning migration routes or organizing social structures. The result is a quiet transformation. Minds that once relied on instinct and immediate feedback begin constructing short sequences of imagined outcomes. There is still no language, no symbolic structure, but there is an increasingly stable relationship between intention and material response. The stone becomes a mediator between thought and environment. With every flake produced, the brain strengthens its capacity for abstraction. This is not abstraction in the modern sense. Early hominins did not view the core as an object with potential shapes. But the act of anticipating a flake is already a form of imagining a possibility not yet present. And imagination, however faint its early form, is a turning point in evolution. It bridges the gap between action and meaning. As the older one tradition spreads across Africa and later into Eurasia, we observe remarkable consistency in basic fracture strategies. This consistency requires cultural transmission. Cultural transmission requires memory. Memory requires neural networks stable enough to encode sequences. Thus, by the time reliable flake production appears, the neural groundwork for conceptual learning has already been laid. What began at Lomekwi as exploratory force has become predictive force. What began as curiosity has become expectation. A brain that once reacted to the world now reaches forward into it. The realization here is that the first purposeful edge did not simply change hands, it changed minds. The fracture pattern reflects a cognitive pattern. Intentionality grows within the rhythm of striking, observing, adjusting. With each successful flake, a feedback loop strengthens. The world responds to action, and action becomes structured by expected response. Through this iterative process, a new kind of mind emerges, not yet symbolic, not yet reflective, but capable of linking past practice to future outcomes. This marks the beginning of human-style reasoning. It is fragile, primitive, and embedded in physical labour, but it is unmistakably present. And once this capacity appears, it becomes the foundation for all later technological systems. And from this first fragile link between intention and matter, the world itself began offering new shapes for the hand to learn. Picture a moment when a hand closes around a stone and something in its structure finally cooperates with intention. Imagine a joint that had long been a companion of branches and bark suddenly beginning to answer a different kind of demand. The demand for precision, for pressure, for torque. What if I told you that the human thumb, the one you use for every modern gesture from writing to touching a screen, first entered history not as an accessory to climbing or grasping fruit, but as a joint reshaped by the repeated shock of stone against stone? There's a quiet truth in the fossil record. Before tools changed our minds, they changed our thumbs. To understand how that transformation began, we must begin with the hands that came before tools were part of daily life. Australopith thumbs were competent but limited. They were shorter relative to finger length, and their carpometacarpal joint, the saddle joint at the base of the thumb, offered only partial rotation. Its structure was still bound to arboreal needs, optimized for power grips in climbing, where the thumb reinforces the fingers in resisting downward pull. The bone surfaces were broad and strong, but their orientation favoured force in one direction rather than many. In other words, the thumb could push and brace, but it could not yet twist, pivot or oppose with the fine modulation later toolmakers would require. It was a thumb built for stability, not manipulation. The real transformation begins with the earliest members of the genus Homo. Fossils attributed to Homo habilis and Homo erectus reveal the first unmistakable signs of a thumb adapted for controlled force application and multi-directional stability. The saddle joint becomes more curved, increasing its capacity to rotate and oppose the fingers at different angles. The first metacarpal thickens, allowing the transfer of greater torque without damaging the joint. Muscle attachment sites along the thenar region enlarge, suggesting not only greater strength but also increased fine motor control. These anatomical changes appear not as isolated features but as part of an integrated shift toward a hand designed to shape and be shaped. What drove this shift? The archaeological record offers a clear pattern. As stone tools become more standardized and intentional between 2,600,000 and 1,500,000 years ago, thumb morphology changes in parallel. Creating a controlled flake requires a specific alignment of force. The hammerstone must meet the core at a precise angle, and the core must be supported with stability and counter-pressure. The thumb is central in this act. It directs the core, stabilizes its rotation, and absorbs part of the shock. Repetition of these motions across countless individuals and many generations created selective pressures on the thumb joint. The thumb that could better oppose, better rotate, better handle force, produced more successful tools and thus supported more reliable access to high-calorie foods. The anatomy follows the activity. Biomechanics confirms this story. The human carpometacarpal joint functions as a true saddle, with two surfaces that curve in perpendicular directions. This configuration allows both flexion and extension, as well as abduction, adduction, and importantly axial rotation. Rotation is what transforms a simple grip into a precision grip. It enables the thumb to meet the index finger pad to pad, creating a pincer-like grasp capable of controlling small objects and modulating pressure. In apes, the joint surfaces are flatter and oriented differently, allowing powerful grips but limiting opposition range. Australopiths fall somewhere in between, leaning closer to apes in functional capacity. Homo, by contrast, exhibits a pronounced curvature that increases rotation while maintaining joint stability under load. But the joint alone does not create this capability. The musculature that supports the thumb changes alongside the joint. In early Homo fossils, the attachment site for the opponent's pollicis muscle is more pronounced. This muscle is responsible for bringing the thumb across the palm, enabling true opposition. Other thinner muscles, such as the abductor pollicis brevis and flexor pollicis brevis, also expand their surface areas. Together they create a muscular tripod that stabilizes the thumb during precision grips. This expansion is not a trivial modification, but a fundamental reconfiguration of force distribution within the hand. It is here that the thumb begins to transition from a support digit into a manipulative instrument. Fossil evidence supports this narrative with striking detail. The thumb bones from Olduvai hominid 7, attributed to Homo habilis, display a broad metacarpal head and deep articulating surfaces, indicating greater joint stability. The shape and orientation of these surfaces suggest increased capability for loading in multiple directions, a requirement for stone tool production. Later fossils of Homo erectus, such as those from Cubiphora and Swartkrans, continue this trend, showing both increased robusticity and joint complexity. These features do not appear in Australopith species, even though Australopiths possessed some capacity for manipulation. Their thumbs were strong, but not engineered for the directional versatility that flakes require. The archaeological context reinforces this distinction. Sites associated with early Homo contain tools with consistent fracture patterns, suggesting repeated mastery of specific angles and force applications. These tools are the products of hands that can stabilize a core, rotate it slightly, align it with the hammerstone, and deliver a controlled strike. Each of these actions relies on the thumb's ability to oppose and pivot. When we find clusters of flakes with striking platform angles that fall within narrow ranges, we are witnessing the anatomical legacy of thumb evolution. The anatomy is readable in the artifacts. It is also readable in the wear patterns preserved on fossil thumb bones. Micro-CT studies of cortical thickness in early Homo show asymmetric reinforcement consistent with repeated force applied through precision grips. This indicates not just occasional tool use but habitual engagement. The cortical reinforcement appears strongest near the base of the metacarpal, where rotational forces concentrate. The thumb was not simply participating, it was bearing the defining mechanical load of stoneworking. These anatomical changes have broader cognitive implications. The ability to use a precision grip expands the range of possible actions. When the thumb can manipulate small flakes, the individual can refine edges, control pressure, and create more effective implements. This in turn drives innovation in tool production, which demands further neural coordination. Thus, the thumb becomes both a product and a driver of cognitive evolution. It anchors the feedback loop in which tools shape anatomy and anatomy shapes tool-making capacity. This interplay also reflects in social learning. A hand capable of fine manipulation conveys more information when imitated. When one individual watches another rotate a core or apply controlled pressure with the thumb, the observer's mirror neuron system activates in ways that support imitation. The thumb's enhanced range allows these actions to be more easily understood and reproduced. This increases the fidelity of cultural transmission, reinforcing toolmaking traditions. Over time, the thumb becomes a medium through which knowledge passes between individuals. It is not only an anatomical feature but also a cultural conduit. At the environmental level, the thumb's transformation influences resource access. Controlled flake production enables more effective butchery, allowing early Homo to exploit carcasses more efficiently. Nutrient-rich marrow and meat become more reliably accessible. This increases caloric intake, which supports larger brain growth. Brain growth then enhances planning and coordination, reinforcing tool reliance and further selecting for thumb morphology that optimizes tool use. Evolution here is not linear but cyclical. The stone demands force, the thumb adapts, the tool improves, the brain expands, the tool becomes central, the thumb becomes indispensable. The realization that emerges from this interplay is that the human thumb is not simply a biological structure, but the first known body part sculpted by technology. Its shape reflects not only what our ancestors were, but what they did. The thumb that enters history is not an inheritance from the trees, but a response to the stones on the ground. It carries the memory of impacts repeated across thousands of lifetimes, of flakes produced in quiet moments by riverbanks, of hands learning to collaborate with the materials around them. In its joint surfaces, we see the earliest intersection of biology and culture. In its curvature, the first whisper of engineering. And as the thumb transformed, the rest of the hand began to follow. Its new demands altered the muscles, joints, and even the neural circuits that controlled it. When the thumb changed, the hand changed. When the hand changed, the tool changed. When the tool changed, the species changed. And in the wake of this transformation, the rest of the hand would soon shift to meet the new world the thumb had opened. A hand that has not moved for tens of thousands of years suddenly appears before you, in the quiet of a museum drawer, its bones pale and weightless, yet holding within their inner lattice a history of every motion their owner repeated across a life. We rarely think of bone as something that learns, but the deeper we look into the fossil hands of early humans and their relatives, the clearer the story becomes. Bone carries the memory of use. Each strike, each grip, each moment of force passing through the wrist leaves subtle traces that outlast languages, cultures, and entire species. And when we measure those traces, a pattern emerges that is impossible to explain without acknowledging the central role of tools in shaping our skeletons long before written history began. What if I told you that inside every hand bone lies a forest of microscopic struts, arranged not randomly, but according to the stresses a life repeatedly imposed upon them? This in architecture, known as trabecular structure, responds to force the way dunes respond to wind, gradually, silently, but unmistakably. We do not know for certain the pace at which these microstructural adjustments accumulated in early hominin hands, but the evidence suggests that long before modern humans appeared, repetitive loading from grasping and striking was already etching patterns into bone. These patterns differ in australopiths, early Homo, Neanderthals, and modern humans, not because the bones were made differently at birth, but because each lineage spent its lifetime solving different mechanical problems. As researchers turned high-resolution imaging toward fossil hand bones in the early years of the 21st century, something subtle but extraordinary came to light. The internal bone density of the thumb and index finger of early Homo did not resemble that of climbing primates or generalist foragers. Instead, it showed a reinforcing thickening along directions consistent with repeated precision grips and forceful pad-to-pad pressure. The hand was adapting to tasks that required deliberate control over small but powerful movements, tasks that left more pronounced stress signatures in the thumb metacarpal and the distal phalanges than elsewhere. Although stone tools themselves rarely survive intact in these earliest periods, the bones of the users remember the kind of work they were doing. Picture, for a moment, a Neanderthal hand. Not a reconstruction in a showcase, but the living hand of a person standing somewhere on a wind-exposed ridge roughly 60,000 years ago, gripping a hafted flake while preparing hides or shaping wooden shafts. When we examine actual Neanderthal bones, the most striking difference compared to modern humans is not only their overall robustness, but the orientation and density of internal trabecula that reflect extreme, lifelong loading. Neanderthals experienced far greater compressive forces across the thumb joint than we do. Their first metacarpal bones show reinforcement patterns consistent with repeated power grips and strong lateral torque. This implies tasks that required not only precision, but sustained force over long durations, possibly linked to their habitual use of heavy-duty tools and close-range hunting strategies. In contrast, when we look at the inner structure of early modern human hand bones dating from the Upper Paleolithic, we find a slightly different architecture. The thumb is still reinforced, but the distribution of stress lines suggests more varied loading patterns, involving both precision grip and complex tool manipulation. This points to a greater flexibility in the types of hand movements performed over a lifetime, hinting at technological diversity and more specialized toolkits. The bones did not simply grow this way, they learned this way. We do not know for certain the exact behaviors that produced each microfracture or density shift, but we can infer their causes by comparing fossil morphology with experimental biomechanics. When modern flint knappers spend years striking cores, their hand bones develop micro-damage patterns similar to those observed in archaeological populations. The wrist stiffens slightly, the thumb joint thickens, the base of the index finger reveals tiny remodeling zones aligned with the direction of repeated force transfer. These living experiments allow us to confirm what fossils only whisper. Bone adapts to repetition, and repetition defines a technological tradition. When osteologists measure handedness in prehistoric individuals, they do not look for dominant hands the way we do today. Instead, they examine asymmetry. If the right hand is consistently subjected to more forceful or more frequent load-bearing tasks, its internal trabeculae become denser and more directionally aligned than those of the left. In Neanderthals, pronounced asymmetry often indicates strong right-hand dominance, which matches tooth-wear evidence showing directional striations from holding material in the teeth while cutting with the right hand. The skeleton confirms what the edges left behind. These individuals lived in bodies shaped by tools, their movements and habits recorded in bone. In early Homo populations from between 1 million and 2 million years ago, the asymmetry is subtler but still present. A lifetime of using hammerstones, preparing cores, and butchering animals left a quiet signature. These people did not write or carve symbols, but their bones carry a record of repeated actions that eventually distinguish them from their ancestors. Even when stone tools are missing or rare in a site, the shape of the hand bones can reveal whether a population relied on tool use as a central part of its daily life. One of the most revealing lines of research compares trabecular structure in fossil hominins with that of chimpanzees. Chimpanzee hands experience significant loading during climbing and knuckle walking, but this loading is distributed differently. Their thumb metacarpals show much less reinforcement, and their phalanges demonstrate curvature optimized for grasping thick branches rather than manipulating small objects. Early hominin hand bones, even before full-fledged tool-making traditions emerged, already show departures from this pattern. But it is only with the sustained and repetitive use of stone that these differences become unmistakable. The thumb begins to demonstrate greater torsional resistance. The joints become more stable under compressive loads. The bone adapts to tasks that require fine control coupled with strength. Imagine a craftsman living 800,000 years ago. Every morning he selects a new core. His thumb braces it. His wrist absorbs shock. His fingers maintain the angle of percussion. He performs these actions for decades. By the end of his life, even if all his tools were to disappear, the cross-sections of his bones would still tell the story of what he did. When we find such bones today, they carry the echoes of repetition the way a well-used path holds the memory of countless footsteps. What surprises researchers most is not just that tool use altered the inner bones of the hand, but that these changes persisted across generations. Bones remodel over a single lifetime, but populations show consistent long-term patterns that reflect shared behaviours. This means that technological traditions imprint themselves biologically, reinforcing certain loading conditions across entire communities. A lineage that relies heavily on percussion-based flaking will differ structurally from one that depends on fine crafting, even if both use stone. We cannot say with certainty that early hominins understood this process. They were not consciously shaping their bones, but their actions did. This is one of the quiet truths of human evolution. Behavior precedes anatomy. The bones that have survived until today are not simply remnants of individuals. They are material memories of repeated decisions, repeated gestures, repeated demands placed on flesh and joint and ligament. The fossil record becomes a story not only of what people made, but of what those creations made of them. As we examine this deep time story, a realization forms. Bone remembers not single events, but habits. A fossil hand is a biography of tasks repeated until muscle and skeleton could not help but adapt. Every ridge, every thickened joint surface, every reinforced trabecular network inside the thumb speaks of years spent shaping, scraping, cutting, and holding. Tools did not merely extend human capability. They entered into the architecture of the body itself, altering form through use. And when we look closely at these hands across species and across ages, we see that the story is not only about survival, it is about the gradual construction of a body increasingly suited to a technological life. Stone reshaped us long before we reshaped stone into anything complex. The bones bear witness in their silence, and if bone could change through repetition, the muscles and tendons that animated those bones would soon follow. A hand is raised, not in warning, not in greeting, but in preparation for a sound that did not yet belong to the living world. The stone is lifted, the arm draws back, and something inside the wrist waits for the shock that will travel through bone, tendon and joint. Before tools, that shock had nowhere to go. After tools, the body began to learn its path. The first time a hominin struck one stone against another with intention rather than accident, the wrist felt everything long before the mind understood what it had done. What if I told you that the story of tool-making is written just as clearly in the mechanisms of the wrist as in any stone flake scattered across an ancient river terrace? We tend to imagine hands as the centre of manipulation, but the evidence suggests that the wrist was the true hinge on which early cognition turned. It stands halfway between the anchored bones of the forearm and the delicate architecture of the fingers, absorbing impact forces and translating them into controlled movement. Without the right balance of stiffness and flexibility, a blow intended to fracture stone would instead fracture the hand that delivered it. We do not know the exact moment when this transformation began, but fossils allow us to recognize a pattern that extends across millions of years. In the wrist of a chimpanzee, the carpal bones are arranged for suspensory locomotion, supporting the body during climbing and the controlled descent of vertical trunks. The joint allows a range of extension that would be dangerous in a human, but it is not well suited for the compressive force of repeated percussive movements. In contrast, the human wrist shows reduced shear, reinforced ligament structures, and a narrower envelope of safe motion that sacrifices some climbing versatility for stability under repeated impact. This is not simply a matter of convenience. It is the trace of an evolutionary compromise sealed by thousands upon thousands of blows delivered to raw stone. At sites where the earliest known deliberately shaped flakes appear, the stones bear their own kind of memory, but the wrist bones from hominin fossils nearby reveal another layer. In the capitate, the central bone of the wrist, modern humans show a shape that resists the sliding motion common in other primates. The joint surfaces are arranged so that forces travel down the long axis of the forearm, keeping the energy of impact from tearing ligaments or displacing the smaller carpal bones. When researchers compared these structures across species, they noticed that even early members of the genus Homo had begun to show the same adaptations. It was not the hand alone that became specialized for tool use. It was the whole chain of bones that allowed the hand to move with precision and absorb shock without damage. Picture an early hominin kneeling beside a riverbank, a core rock held steady in one hand while the other prepares the hammerstone. Before the blow, the wrist makes a series of adjustments, some conscious, some guided by reflex. Radial deviation shifts the angle of approach so that the fracture plane of the stone lies where the napper intends. Flexion reduces vulnerability, the grip tightens, and when the hammerstone strikes, the joint locks momentarily, distributing the force through bone and ligament rather than muscle alone. A single blow does little, but over a lifetime, the repetition of this movement shapes not only skill, but the architecture of the joint that performs it. Some of this evidence comes from the internal trabecular structure within wrist bones, mapped through microcomputed tomography rather than surface morphology. Dense networks of tiny struts appear where chronic loading has been absorbed, while other regions show reduced density consistent with the diminished reliance on climbing seen in other primates. The wrist becomes a living record of behavior, just as teeth record diet and leg bones record gait. When researchers compared these internal patterns between Neanderthals and early Homo sapiens, they found that Neanderthals carried signs of especially strong loading, consistent with forceful gripping and heavy percussive activity. Their powerful arms and robust skeletons made them capable of delivering repeated impacts that would have strained the joints of more lightly built humans. Yet the pattern of adaptation in both species converged on the same solution: wrists that could withstand the demands of intentional tool-making. The comparison with chimpanzees illuminates another dimension of the story. Chimp wrists are flexible, capable of bending far backward, which helps absorb shocks when landing on branches or knuckle walking. But this very flexibility becomes a liability when attempting to strike stone with controlled precision. Extension beyond a certain angle risks instability and injury. The human wrist, by contrast, stiffens earlier, providing a platform that allows the thumb and fingers to act with greater mechanical advantage during precision and power grips. This constraint is not a flaw. It is the foundation of a new capacity. The wrist does not simply allow the hand to strike, it teaches the hand how to do so safely. Archaeological experiments, conducted with replicas of early tools, demonstrate how sensitive the wrist is to angle and force. A deviation of even a few degrees can determine whether a flake detaches cleanly or shatters unpredictably. Early toolmakers learned these patterns not through articulation but through sensation. The vibration that travelled up the arm, the discomfort that warned of poor positioning, the slight bruising that signalled improper joint alignment. Over generations, these sensations created a feedback loop. Those who used tools regularly developed musculature and movement habits that eased impact. Those habits, passed through imitation and practice, shaped both culture and biology. At some point, the wrist became not just a joint used for striking, but a structure refined by striking. Its ligaments thickened, its bones widened slightly in regions that absorbed the most force, and its allowable range of movement narrowed into a corridor optimized for stability. This is visible not only in fossil morphology, but also in developmental studies showing that human infants, long before they learn to manipulate objects skillfully, demonstrate neural patterns that favour the kinds of controlled wrist movements that napping requires. The body, in other words, remembers an older world in which these skills mattered deeply. We see additional clues in the environmental context where early toolmaking flourished. River cobbles with good fracture properties encouraged experimentation, but they also enforced consistency. Repetition in toolmaking led to repetition in wrist loading. Over tens of thousands of years, this repetition became a selective pressure, favouring individuals whose joints could sustain these forces with less risk of injury. This does not mean evolution intended the wrist for toolmaking. It means that those whose wrists tolerated the strain better left more surviving descendants. The joint evolved not because stone demanded it, but because stone rewarded it. Gradually, this relationship between wrist mechanics and toolmaking created something more abstract. The wrist is where intention becomes action. It controls the moment when a thought about stone fractures translates into a real fracture. And as toolmaking grew more sophisticated, the demands on the wrist grew with it. Acheulean hand axes required more controlled blows than older one flakes. Later prepared core techniques required even more precise adjustments of angle and timing. Each of these innovations left faint echoes in bone, ligament, and movement habit. What emerges from this long story is an image of the wrist as a sensory organ as much as mechanical one. It feels vibration, weight, resistance, and trajectory. It calibrates itself through touch and movement, and its evolution marks the moment when the human body began preparing itself for a world in which shaping the environment became as important as responding to it. The realization is simple but profound. Before tools reshaped landscapes, they reshaped the body that wielded them. The wrist was not merely a passive structure absorbing shock. It became the hinge of a new kind of behaviour, one in which intention, precision, and force converged. And from that convergence emerged a toolmaker capable of far more than striking stone. And the shift in joints soon required a shift in minds. A hand lifts a rounded stone, a core rests on the ground, and before the strike ever lands, something silent unfolds in the space between intention and action. A network inside the brain lights a path that did not exist in any earlier ancestor. A path carved not by instinct alone, but by the demands of shaping the world. We do not have direct access to the thoughts of a hominin living more than 1 million years ago, but modern neuroscience gives us a map of what the brain must accomplish when a human today tries to replicate the ancient art of napping. And when we compare those illuminated regions to the changes we can trace across the fossil record, the story becomes clear. Stone did not simply follow thought. It taught the brain new ways of thinking. What if I told you that every flake removed from a stone begins long before the hammerstone moves? Functional M. Eye studies show that the moment a napper imagines the sequence of blows necessary to detach a flake, the prefrontal cortex activates in a pattern closely associated with hierarchical planning. This is not the simple action of lifting an arm or tightening a grip. It is a layered decision tree. Which edge is prepared, which platform aligns correctly, which angle will propagate a fracture through the material. The evidence suggests that the hominin brain that first undertook this task had to recruit new combinations of regions to manage the logic of controlled fracture. Even more striking, the cerebellum, often stereotyped as merely coordinating movement, shows heightened engagement in predicting the trajectory of each strike. It is the hidden mathematician of the brain, calculating error margins before the toolmaker even swings. Archaeologists studying the earliest known flake technologies at places such as Lomekwi and the older Wan sites in East Africa have long noted that these tools required more planning than their simple form suggests. But when modern nappers attempt to reproduce older Wan flakes inside MRI machines, the parietal lobes brighten, especially regions involved in spatial integration and the translation between vision and action. The stone becomes not just an object, but a geometry problem the body must solve. The parietal cortex maps angles, assesses curvature, predicts shock lines, and represents the potential flake before it exists. For a brain living nearly 2.5 million years ago, this would have been novel territory. The action of cracking nuts or tearing bark does not require such coordination. Older one napping does. Another pattern appears as well, one that surprised researchers when first observed. When a napper evaluates whether a core is suitable for a particular reduction sequence, activity increases in the anterior cingulate cortex, a structure involved in conflict monitoring, decision-making, and the ability to shift strategies when conditions change. This is exactly the sort of cognitive flexibility archaeologists infer from the archaeological record as tool industries diversify. In older one sites we see repeated attempts, abandoned cores, and alternative reduction pathways. The brain was not merely executing a set of motor commands. It was engaging in a quiet negotiation with stone. Try here, no. Rotate, angle, try again. A loop of feedback and correction, mirrored millions of years later in neural imaging experiments. The revelation deepens when we look at the transition toward Acheulean bifaces. Experimental nappers producing hand axes inside fMRI scanners demonstrate greater activation in Broca's area than those producing simple flakes. Broca's area is widely known for its association with language processing, but its broader role involves sequencing complex actions and managing hierarchical structures. An Herculean hand axe demands long chains of action, thinning, shaping, balancing mass across symmetrical halves, predicting the consequences of each strike. The implication is cautious but profound. The neural architecture that would one day support structured language may have been strengthened in part by the mechanical demands of shaping stone. We do not know whether early Herculean toolmakers had anything resembling language as we understand it. Yet the fossil record shows steady increases in cranial capacity during the period when Herculean technologies spread across Africa and Eurasia. This enlargement cannot be attributed to tools alone, but the cognitive load of complex toolmaking offers a plausible contributor. Brains are metabolically expensive organs. They do not enlarge without selective pressure. The ability to make and teach bifacial tools may have provided such pressure by linking success in foraging to improve planning and perception. Mirror neuron systems add another layer to the story. In modern humans, observing someone nap a tool activates neural circuits similar to those engaged in performing the task. This system, found in parts of the premotor cortex and parietal lobe, may have facilitated the transmission of toolmaking skills long before language fully emerged. When a novice watched an expert prepare a core, the viewer's brain rehearsed the sequence internally, priming the neural pathways required for eventual mastery. Over generations, such observational learning could have produced strong cultural continuity, stabilizing tool forms and reinforcing the cognitive architecture required to maintain them. Archaeological evidence supports this. Sites separated by hundreds of kilometers and thousands of years show nearly identical reduction strategies, suggesting that the know-how was passed down through bodies and minds tuned to imitate. The brain's growing ability to record sequences of action, compare them, refine them, and eventually innovate upon them is visible not only in neural imaging but in the stones themselves. Each scar on a core represents a decision, and each decision reflects a mind increasingly shaped by the feedback loops of perception, motor control, memory, and social learning. The cerebellum's role becomes particularly important here. Traditionally viewed as a coordinator of movement, modern research shows that the cerebellum participates in forward modelling. It predicts the consequences of actions before they occur, allowing the body to operate smoothly in complex environments. In napping, where the consequences of one strike determine the options available for the next, forward modelling becomes essential. The earliest toolmakers who could imagine the outcome of a blow before delivering it had a significant advantage. They wasted less material, produced more effective tools, and likely became the individuals others sought to imitate. Even the sensory experience of toolmaking leaves marks in the brain. The vibration that travels from stone to wrist to arm is not a simple physical effect. It is feedback, processed by somatosensory regions that gradually learn to interpret subtle differences in stone quality. Experiments show that skilled nappers use auditory cues as well. The pitch of a fracture, the crispness of a flake's detachment, the muted thud of an unsuccessful strike all become part of a sensory vocabulary. These cues activate auditory association areas, linking sound with action and outcome. For ancient hominins, such multisensory integration would have fostered the expansion of neural networks that interpret complex environmental signals. The more we examine the neural pathways engaged during toolmaking, the more we see a system of interactions that extend beyond the act itself. A napper must remember sequences, evaluate failures, shift strategies, and maintain attention over long periods. Each of these tasks recruits different brain regions, and repeated practice strengthens the connections between them. This is how learning becomes structure. Over evolutionary time, habitual behaviors influence selection. Individuals whose neural wiring handle these demands more effectively may have had greater survival and reproductive success. Toolmaking also anchors social context that reinforce neural development. Teaching a skill requires attention to others' movements, sensitivity to mistakes, and the ability to predict where guidance is needed. This engages theory of mind networks, as modern studies show. Even if early hominins lacked complex symbolic communication, the act of demonstrating toolmaking would have demanded social cognition. Watching hands move, anticipating the next motion, and interpreting intention through action alone all require specialized neural circuits. Thus, the brain's social and technical domains may have evolved together, braided through the shared necessity of shaping stone. There is a final insight fMRI research reveals, one that resonates deeply with the archaeological record. When modern humans nap in experimental settings, their brains activate in a manner consistent with creative problem-solving. Regions associated with abstract thought and mental simulation brighten when a napper must decide how to correct a mistake or adapt a technique to a new stone. This resembles the neural pattern seen in tasks that involve planning for distant outcomes. For early hominins, the ability to foresee possibilities beyond the immediate moment may have been fostered, not by language or symbolic thought alone, but by stone. The realization is quiet and profound. The first tools did not simply extend the body, they extended the mind. They demanded neural innovations that reshaped how hominins perceived space, predicted outcomes, learned from each other, and organized sequences of action. The archaeological traces of these behaviors lie scattered across ancient riverbeds and lake margins, but the deeper evidence remains in the neural architectures we carry still. Every time a modern napper imagines the next flake, adjusts an angle, or listens to the pitch of a fracture, they reenact a conversation between brain and stone that began hundreds of thousands of years ago. And so, when we study the evolution of the mind, we cannot separate thought from the tools that shaped it. The brain learned to plan, to predict, to evaluate, to imagine, because stone required it. In this sense, stone was not merely a medium, it was a teacher, and that teaching pushed our ancestors towards something new. And as the brain adapted to stone, stone quietly began adapting to the landscapes where humans lived. A moment when an ancient hominin sat down to butcher an animal and did not know that in the process they were leaving behind a record of the side of their body they trusted most. We tend to think of handedness as something intimate, almost private, a preference formed in childhood and carried quietly through life. Yet the deep archaeological record holds signs that long before language, long before symbolic marks or deliberate art, the earliest makers and users of stone tools were already leaning into one side of their bodies more than the other. Picture a tooth dragged across a strip of hide held firmly at the lips. Picture the scrape lines that form when a stone flake slips for a moment and grazes enamel. Those small traces, preserved in the fossil faces of individuals who lived hundreds of thousands of years before recorded history, open a window into how hemispheres of the brain began to differentiate and specialize. They show that the preference between left and right, which feels so ordinary today, was once an evolutionary experiment played out across entire landscapes. What if I told you that some of the earliest clues for this preference do not come from hands at all but from teeth? When hominins processed hides or fibrous plant material, they often held the item at the mouth and pulled it taut, using one hand while the other hand cut or scraped. The resulting abrasion on the enamel does not appear randomly. The direction of the microscopic striations intersects with the curvature of the tooth at consistent angles that correspond to whether a right hand or a left hand performed the scraping motion. We do not know the intentions behind these early actions, and we cannot ask the individuals who left these marks, but we can examine the pattern. In many specimens of Homo heidelbergensis and later Neanderthals, the angles overwhelmingly point to a rightward motion. This suggests that the hand wielding the tool was most often the right one. The archaeological record becomes a silent repository not only of tools and bones, but of repeated bodily motions performed without any awareness that they were being documented. From teeth we turn to bones that were never meant to reveal how hands moved. Cut marks on animal remains tell us not only that stone tools were used for butchery, but also the direction from which those tools approached flesh. The angle of entry, the profile of the flake edge, and the way a slicing motion tapers off at the end of a stroke all embed a kind of signature. If a group of early Acheulean hunters processed carcasses with a consistent preference for holding the cutting tool in a particular hand, those marks accumulate across a site. They form a distribution that can be measured thousands of years later. Archaeologists have analysed these patterns in butchery sites from East Africa to Western Europe. Many show an uneven distribution of cut directionality. The simplest explanation, though always stated cautiously, is handedness, not temporary or arbitrary, but a widespread preference that hints at deeper neural organisation. Further evidence lies in the stones themselves. When a toolmaker strikes a core to detach a flake, the blow direction relative to body position and the orientation of the platform create distinctive scar patterns on the final tool. In Oldowan and Acheulean assemblages, certain scars are more common on one side of flakes than the other. This consistency suggests that many knappers approach their material with similar body orientation. While handedness cannot be inferred from a single piece, large assemblages show that right-handed removal patterns are far more frequent. The stability of this pattern across long spans of time may indicate that lateralized motor behaviors had already emerged. Scholars note that even chimpanzees exhibit some lateralization, though not as consistently. But the archaeological signature we see in hominin tools is more pronounced. It suggests that once stone became a regular part of daily life, the body had to negotiate the cognitive and motor demands of its use, and in doing so it began to reinforce one-sided behaviours that offered efficiency and control. To understand why this mattered, we must step inside the brain, though the evidence we use comes from modern neuroscientific studies rather than fossils. When contemporary individuals learn or practice stone knapping in controlled laboratory settings, functional imaging reveals strong activation in the left hemisphere of the brain, particularly in areas tied to motor planning, tool sequencing, and fine-grained control of the hands. This activation overlaps with regions known for language processing, though this does not imply that early hominin toolmaking was linguistic. What it shows is that the circuits that manage ordered action and those that eventually manage structured speech reside in adjacent neural neighbourhoods. The left hemisphere begins to dominate because the structure of the task demands it. Over time, repeated use of one hand strengthens neural pathways dedicated to its control. This creates a feedback loop. The more one side is used, the more the brain accommodates it, and the stronger the preference becomes. This pattern may help explain why right-handedness is so common in modern humans. If ancestral populations performing repetitive, skilled tasks favoured the right hand, that preference would have shaped developmental pathways, but caution is essential. We cannot assert that early hominins had the same neural wiring as modern humans. What we can say is that the archaeological evidence for directional tool use aligns with what neuroscientists observe in motor task learning today. The connection is inferential, not direct, but it is a connection supported by two independent lines of evidence. Another layer of information comes from wear patterns on stone tools themselves. Experimental archaeology has shown that when right-handed knappers produce flakes, the platforms often slope slightly in a consistent direction. Percussion angles tend to cluster in predictable ranges, When archaeologists find ancient flakes with those same angle distributions, it suggests that the behaviour behind their manufacture mirrored the right-handed motions produced in modern experiments. These findings appear not just in one geographic region, but in multiple Paleolithic contexts. They hint at an underlying pattern that remains stable across different groups, who may never have interacted. The importance of this becomes clear when we consider the broader implications. Lateralization of hand use is not merely a behavioural detail. It is a sign of hemispheric specialization in the brain. In species where handedness is weak or absent, the hemispheres tend to share processing tasks more evenly. But once a species begins to rely on skilled, repeated manual tasks requiring precision, the brain finds efficiency in dedicating certain regions to those tasks. This frees other regions to manage complementary functions. Over evolutionary time, this division of labour can influence cognitive development. It is possible that the rise of consistent handedness among hominins contributed to the emergence of higher-order planning and symbolic representation. That link is not yet provable, but the association between lateralization and advanced cognitive tasks is well documented in neuroscience. Consider also the social dimension. When a novice napper learned from an experienced instructor, the gestures they observed were not abstract. They were embodied motions. If the teacher was right-handed, the student observing the movements from a mirrored perspective might have found it easier to use the same hand to copy the technique rather than reverse it. This would subtly reinforce population-level handedness. Over generations, such learning biases could accumulate, making right-handed behaviour statistically favoured. This mechanism does not require genetic predisposition. It only requires that certain body positions feel more natural when imitating a skilled model. And yet the archaeological record also shows variation. Not every site displays the same dominance. Some assemblages contain a mixture of removal angles that might indicate a more balanced distribution of left and right-handed nappers. This diversity reminds us that human evolution is rarely uniform. Different populations, shaped by different ecological pressures and cultural habits, may not have shared the same biases. Still, the overall directionality remains surprisingly consistent. There is far more right-oriented evidence than left-oriented evidence across early toolmaking contexts. What realizes itself through all of this is a simple but profound insight. Handedness is not only a matter of preference, it is a mapping of the brain onto the world. When we see a cut mark slanting at a particular angle, or a flake scar curving in a predictable direction, we are seeing the shadows of neural patterns that once guided a living hand. These traces suggest that the mind was becoming asymmetric, that it was beginning to divide tasks between hemispheres in ways that would later support complex behaviour. There is humility in this realization. The earlier signs of this specialization are not grand achievements. They are small marks on teeth, subtle scars on stone, quiet angles left behind by individuals who never considered what they were revealing. Even today, when a modern napper replicates Acheulean or Oldowan techniques, their own handedness influences the shape and orientation of their tools. The past and present fold together in these experiments. They show that certain neurological and motor constraints remain constant, shaped by millions of years of embodied practice. We do not know whether early hominins were aware of their preferences, but the archaeological record makes one thing clear. Handedness emerged early, persisted widely, and left a trace that spans continents and epochs. And in that quiet trace, we see the beginning of hemispheric negotiation. The early movements of a brain learning to specialize and to distribute work across its structure. A mind that began to rely on one hand more than the other was also a mind that was learning efficiency, sequencing, categorization, and attention. These cognitive traits would later support symbolic systems, though that story belongs to later chapters. Here, in this moment, handedness is simply a record of repeated motions, carried through bodies and environments, written in angles that remain even after flesh has vanished. And the evidence we find suggests that these motions were not accidental. They were part of a larger pattern of how hominins interacted with their world. As we trace this pattern across time, it becomes one more thread in the fabric of human becoming, a sign that the path toward cognitive complexity was shaped not just by brain size or social structures, but by the quiet repetition of hands performing familiar tasks. And as we follow that thread, we begin to see how the first flicker of mental asymmetry grew into the foundation for later innovations, both technological and conceptual. The tools tell us this story, and the traces left upon them speak of a mind organising itself, and that organisation would soon give rise to new forms of control. Transition. And from that growing control emerged the first signs of deliberate shaping, not just of stone, but of intention itself. You reach out into the world not with a thought or a plan, but with the surface of your skin. Before any tool existed, before stone edges or wooden shafts or shaped bone, early hominins touched their world directly. They felt bark with their fingertips, soil under their palms, the coarse fur of animals that moved past them, the wind shifting across exposed knuckles. Their survival depended on interpreting these signals. Yet something changed when the first sharp stones appeared. Touch became not only a sense for navigating the environment, but a conduit for controlling external tools that extended the body. And in that shift, the evolution of the human fingertip began to take a new direction. We rarely notice this today. We open a jar, tie a knot, or unlock a screen without thinking about the sensory machinery beneath the surface. But the biology behind these small actions is the result of a long history in which the skin learned to speak the language of tools. What if I told you that the sensitivity of the human fingertip rivals that of the whiskers of some mammals? The density of nerve endings in the pads of our fingers is extraordinary, far exceeding what is needed for climbing or simple manipulation. Inside these tiny zones of skin lie Meissner corpuscles, receptors tuned for detecting minute changes in texture, vibration, and movement. They respond not only to the surface being touched, but to the way that surface pushes back, whether it glides or resists, whether it is sharp or dull. Two-point discrimination, the ability to perceive two closely spaced points as separate, is among the finest in the animal kingdom. These capacities allowed early tool users to control and adjust their grip with incredible nuance, and the presence of these receptors in such high density raises an important question. Did they evolve solely for tactile exploration of natural environments, or did the repetitive demands of manipulating tools gradually shape their refinement? We do not know the precise moment when tactile sensitivity became linked to tool use, but we can examine how the physiology of the fingertip functions today whenever someone performs stone napping. As the hammerstone approaches the core, the fingers holding the material relay constant feedback about stability, pressure, and micro-movement. The skin registers the smallest tremors, sending rapid signals to the brain that adjust the hand position in fractions of a second. The same is true for fine tasks such as retouching flakes or resharpening edges. Each stroke depends on reading the stone through touch. Meissner corpuscles respond instantly to the slight shift in texture as a flake begins to detach. Pacinian corpuscles deeper in the skin detect vibrations caused by percussive impact. Together these receptors provide a sensory map of the tool, almost as if the stone were part of the body. Experiments conducted in controlled settings with modern nappers reveal that when individuals shape stone tools, their sensory systems are continuously active. Even when blindfolded, experienced nappers can detect subtle changes in the thickness of a flake or the readiness of a platform. This is not a learned trick. It is the consequence of a nervous system already tuned by millions of years of evolutionary refinement. Many mammals exhibit tactile sensitivity, but few combine it with a precision grip and long-form manipulation of external objects. That combination is what allowed the fingertips of our ancestors to become specialized for translating environmental feedback into motor action. Archaeological evidence provides indirect support for this evolutionary story. The consistency of fine retouch on Middle Stone Age points, the symmetry of Acheulean bifaces, and the precise shaping of microliths all indicate that early humans had a tactile capacity far beyond what is needed for basic survival tasks. The surface finish of some tools requires repeated, controlled contact along narrow edges. This degree of manipulation suggests not only cognitive planning, but highly tuned sensory input. Without sensitive fingertips capable of detecting small changes in resistance or angle, such craftsmanship would have been impossible. But how do we know that this sensitivity was present in ancient populations rather than a modern development? One answer lies in the morphology of fingertip bones. Though skin itself does not fossilize, the bone supporting it can offer clues. Studies of distal phalanges from Homo sapiens, Neanderthals, and earlier hominins show variations in size, curvature, and robusticity that correlate with patterns of mechanical loading. Neanderthal fingertips, for example, often show broader apical tufts, supporting the idea that their fingertips bore significant force during tasks involving pressure and grip. These structural differences imply that the hands of various hominin lineages adapted not only to their environments, but to the specific tactile and mechanical demands of their tools. Furthermore, the neural pathways associated with touch provide insight into how tactile sensitivity and tool use may have co-evolved. When a person holds a tool, the brain maps the object as an extension of the hand. Regions of the somatosensory cortex respond to vibrations and pressure transmitted through the tool as if they were occurring directly on the skin. This phenomenon is called tool embodiment, and it is not a simple psychological illusion. It is a measurable neural process. The brain reorganizes itself to incorporate external objects into its body schema. This reorganization relies heavily on tactile input. The more finely tuned the sensory receptors, the better the brain can model the tool and predict its behavior. We can infer that early hominins relied on similar mechanisms. Stone tools generate distinct vibrations when used for cutting, scraping, or shaping. These vibrations would have traveled through the tool into the fingers, providing continuous real-time feedback. Over thousands of repeated actions, neural pathways processing these signals would have strengthened. Enhanced tactile discrimination would confer a survival advantage, allowing tool users to make fewer errors and produce more reliable tools. Over evolutionary time, individuals with more responsive fingertips might have been more successful at toolmaking, leading to gradual refinement of sensory capacity. Consider also the environment in which these skills developed. Early toolmaking often took place on open ground where the wind carried dust and grit, where the edges of cores were sharp enough to cut skin accidentally, where slipping could result in injury. The fingertips needed to recognize danger immediately. A slight change in texture could signal that a flake was about to break unpredictably. A subtle increase in vibration might indicate that the angle of percussion was off. In these contexts, tactile sensitivity was not a luxury. It was essential for managing risk. The study of two-point discrimination thresholds offers additional insight. Modern humans can distinguish 2 points just a few millimeters apart on the fingertips. This resolution is far greater than on most other parts of the body. While we cannot measure this sensitivity directly in ancient hominins, the complexity of their tool industries implies that a similar level of refinement existed long before the Holocene. When shaping stone, being able to sense micro differences in edge thickness or platform geometry influences the success of each strike. This kind of sensory discrimination shapes not only the quality of the final tool, but also the efficiency of the process. Evolution tends to favour efficiency when it enhances reproductive success or survival. What realises itself through these observations is that touch became a gateway for cognitive expansion. The more detailed the sensory input, the more the brain had to process. Increased processing demand can stimulate neural growth. Researchers studying modern tool use have found that skilled craftspeople show expanded somatosensory cortex representation of the fingers they use most. If similar patterns occurred in ancient toolmakers, then repeated tactile interaction with stone could have influenced the development of brain regions linked to touch, motor control, and prediction. The brain was not only learning to manipulate tools, it was learning to interpret the world through them. This interpretation extends beyond stone tools. Early humans used wood, bone, and plant fibers as well. Each material communicates differently through touch. Wood offers subtle grain resistance. Bone has a dense, smooth texture. Fibers create friction that shifts depending on moisture. The fingertips of early humans had to become fluent in all these textures. This fluency would allow them to adapt to changing resources and environments. In this sense, tactile sensitivity was not static. It was dynamic, responsive to the range of materials encountered. There is another layer to this story. Touch also facilitated social knowledge. When individuals learned tool making from others, they often guided the learner's hand, placing their fingers on the correct position or adjusting their grip. This physical guidance transmitted not only technique but sensory expectations. Learners began to recognize how a stable core feels, how a good platform responds, how a flake should detach. The skin became a medium for passing cultural knowledge across generations. Even before the emergence of full language, tactile instruction could have played a central role in skill transmission. In this quiet way, the fingertip became both a biological structure shaped by evolution and a cultural interface shaped by practice. The marks it sensed informed decisions. The sensations it transmitted helped develop entire tool traditions. Over time, the cumulative effect of these tactile demands contributed to the distinct sensory profile of the human hand. Ultimately, the realization here is simple but far-reaching. Tools did not only extend the reach of early humans into their environment, they extended the reach of the sensory system itself. The skin learned to feel through tools, and the brain learned to interpret those feelings with increasing precision. This transformation underscores the intimate relationship between sensory experience and technological ability. As new tool forms emerged, with sharper edges or finer points, sensory demands increased. The fingertips had to adapt to maintain control. This interplay between sensory biology and cultural innovation forms one of the quiet foundations of human evolution. Touch became both a guide and a teacher, and through it, early humans learned to shape not just objects but the conditions of their own development. And as those conditions shifted, the next step in our story emerged. And in that shifting landscape, the grip itself began to change, revealing new possibilities for how the hand could command the world. Imagine a moment when a small pair of eyes looked not at the stone in an elder's hands, but at the elder's hands themselves. Those hands were doing something the child could not yet name, striking one stone against another in a rhythm that sent flakes glancing away in bright arcs. What if I told you that this moment, repeated across hundreds of thousands of years, may have been one of the first sparks of teaching as a structured human behaviour. Something happened in those quiet scenes on savanna edges and river terraces. A child watched, an adult slowed down, attention converged, and from this simple triangulation emerged the first evidence that cognition was no longer only about survival, but about transmission. We do not know the first time a hominin deliberately taught another individual how to make a tool. Archaeology cannot capture intention in the strict sense, but when researchers examine the earliest refitting sequences from Oldowan sites across eastern Africa, patterns appear that exceed mere copying. The removal of flakes follows not only a technical logic but a pedagogical one, with repeated sequences of blows that are easier to observe and imitate than the most efficient paths would have been. This odd inefficiency, preserved in stone for more than 2 million years, is one of the strongest hints that early tool-making was performed in front of observers who needed clarity more than speed. A gesture slowed deliberately becomes in its own way a fossil of teaching. Joint attention is one of the cornerstones of this shift. In humans today, it arises early in infancy. The ability to notice what another individual is noticing, to coordinate gaze and intention. Scholars argue that something like this must have emerged in our lineage long before language. A child and an adult seated beside the same core are participating not just in observation, but in a cognitive exchange. Modern experimental napping studies, using motion capture and eye tracking, show that skilled nappers naturally exaggerate wrist turns and platform preparation steps when they know they're being watched by a novice. The same experiments reveal that novices shift their gaze between the toolmaker's hands and the striking stone in predictable rhythms. These rhythms echo through time and suggest that Oldowan and Acheulean toolmakers were already embedded in proto-pedagogical environments. Imitation itself is not unique to humans, but high-fidelity imitation appears to be. Chimpanzees and other primates learn socially, but they often emulate results rather than replicate sequences. In contrast, early hominin technological traditions show surprising consistency in napping angles and force delivery across vast regions and long spans of time. This consistency cannot be explained by mere observation. It implies an underlying structure of demonstration, repetition, correction, and reinforcement. Each step of a napping gesture requires multiple layers of neural processing. Observing a hand angle, predicting its trajectory, mapping that prediction onto one's own musculature, adjusting force through forward modelling in the cerebellum, and comparing the resulting flake to the desired form. This cascade suggests not only individual intelligence, but a shared neural architecture that evolved to support cross-generational learning. Archaeological evidence also hints at moments when adult toolmakers altered their techniques in ways that indicate the presence of young learners. At some sites, misstruck flakes cluster near well-made cores, suggesting the proximity of novices. Other assemblages include unusually small flakes that seem to fit the hands of younger individuals, implying that children practiced alongside adults. Cut marks on faunal remains show repeated but uneven slicing patterns, consistent with learners attempting tasks that experts later corrected. Across these small signatures of error lies a much larger story. A child's developing brain, guided by mirror neuron systems, was tuning itself to the patterns displayed by an adult. Neurons that fired during observation were shaping synaptic pathways that would eventually produce skilled movements. Through imitation, a brain grew into a toolmaker. Joint attention also opens a doorway into the origins of symbolic thought. Before symbols became marks on cave walls or beads strung on cord, they existed as shared intentions. A child who watches a toolmaker is not only observing motion, but interpreting purpose. The flake is removed not randomly, but to reveal a future edge. The adult's pauses, their examination of the stone, their selection of hammerstones signal meanings that extend beyond raw sensory input. These micro-interpretations lay the groundwork for larger cognitive structures. Over time, the ability to assign significance to action, rather than simply reacting to stimuli, builds the scaffolding for mental representations. This is perhaps the earliest bridge between material culture and cognition. Objects become carriers of intention, and intention becomes a social inheritance. We should be cautious about asserting when formal teaching truly emerged, but patterns in the archaeological record point toward increasing complexity around 1.5 million years ago. Acheulean bifaces, with their symmetrical profiles and extended reduction sequences, almost certainly required structured guidance for novices to master. An inexperienced napper cannot intuit symmetry from casual glances. It must be demonstrated, rotated, critiqued. Here, the adult's role becomes not only a producer of tools, but a custodian of cultural knowledge. Pedagogy becomes a mechanism of stability. Without guidance, Acheulean traditions would not have persisted for more than 1 million years across continents. Their endurance suggests an inherited cognitive skill set rather than spontaneous reinvention each generation. Teaching binds individuals into a cognitive community. The child who watches a napper is not only learning a skill, but entering a lineage. Each gesture learned becomes a thread tying them to ancestors who shaped stones in the same way long before, and with each successful replication, the community strengthens its continuity. The act of demonstrating a gesture implies recognition of the learner's potential. It is an investment of time, energy, and trust. In such exchanges we glimpse the earliest forms of mentorship, cooperation, and social identity. When one individual slows their movements for another to understand, they are participating in a moment that is both biological and cultural. The brain responds by building pathways that anchor attention, empathy, and joint purpose. This is why the image of a child watching a toolmaker resonates. It is one of the earliest scenes where the future of a community depends on shared understanding rather than instinct. What began as observation became imitation, and what became imitation eventually became teaching. And from teaching arose one of the foundations of symbolic cognition, the ability to share meaning intentionally. And as skill passed from hand to hand and mind to mind, the lineage of toolmaking became something larger than the individuals participating in it. And those shared lessons slowly prepared the ground for the next transformation, when hands and minds began shaping not only tools but the social worlds around them. A hand resting on a raw cobble long before it ever struck, fingers adjusting, thumb testing its balance, as if anticipating a shape hidden inside the stone. It is one of the earliest quiet clues that the human lineage began planning, not only with the mind but with the body itself. We often imagine foresight as something that happens behind the eyes, somewhere in the prefrontal corridors of the brain, but the archaeological record offers another route into this story. The hand, with its flexion lines, its stabilizing arcs, and the long memory of its calluses, preserves evidence that planning once emerged first as movement. Long before written symbols, before maps, before even controlled fire was fully mastered, the body rehearsed tomorrow's needs in the way it touched and turned a stone. It is in these small, intimate gestures that the earliest architecture of foresight becomes visible, and it suggests that the line between action and anticipation was never clean. Instead, it blurred slowly as hands learned to prepare for blows that had not yet been struck. What if I told you that some of the best proof for early planning sits not in the shape of finished tools, but in the angles at which hominins held the raw materials before any flake was removed? At sites dated to well over 1 million years ago, the cobbles used for bifacial reduction and early prepared cores display patterns that cannot be explained by spontaneous action. The way percussion angles sit relative to the striking platform, the sequence of earlier removals serving as scaffolding for later ones, and the grip positions implied by microscopic wear all point toward a premeditated structure. The revelation is quiet but profound. The hand was not improvising. It was following an internal script that required anticipation. Each future blow depended on the stability created by the preceding one, and the success of the whole sequence relied on how the napper's fingers positioned the stone in advance. Planning was not an abstract idea. It was a way of holding. We do not know for certain what early hominin cognition felt like, but the physical evidence suggests that predictive sequencing was already embodied in their gestures. Experiments with experienced nappers show that achieving a controlled flake requires subtle pre-adjustments of grip pressure, wrist rotation, and thumb opposition. When replicated on cast of early Acheulean cores, these experiments reveal a remarkably close match between fossil scars and the predictable pattern of angles needed to generate long flakes. This implies that the makers did not merely react to each flake's outcome. Instead, they set up conditions so that flakes yet to be struck could emerge. Predictive removal, long before Levallois, has precursors in these early gestures. The hand, stabilizing the stone according to the next intended stroke, becomes an anatomical ledger of foresight. In this sense, a planned tool begins before it is seen. It begins in how the stone is held. Another layer of evidence lies in the shaping of the striking platform itself. At numerous African sites dating between 1 million and 1.5 million years ago, hominins prepared surfaces not because they needed to in that moment, but because these surfaces would optimize the angle of blows several steps later. Preparing the platform requires holding the core in a way that anticipates how it will be rotated in the future. The necessary changes in wrist orientation, along with adjustments in finger force distribution, suggest a remarkable form of embodied simulation. Much like a modern napper who imagines the trajectory of a flake while merely turning the stone in hand, early toolmakers enacted a rehearsal using only touch and position. This kind of preparation hints at something important. The hand had begun to externalize thought. Each micro-adjustment preserved the outline of a future sequence, and every chosen grip served as a bridge between intention and action. Supporting this interpretation, fossil wrist bones from this period show reinforcement consistent with load-bearing in repeated angular patterns. The orientation of trabecular struts in several early Homo specimens aligns with the rotational forces generated during predictive napping sequences. This indicates not only repeated tool use, but repeated tool use in a patterned way. A spontaneous or purely opportunistic striking habit would leave a far more chaotic biomechanical record. Instead, what we find is regularity, almost rhythm, force directed through similar vectors again and again, strong enough across generations to shape internal bone architecture. This is one of the places where anatomy begins to whisper cognitive evolution. The wrist and hand were stabilizing in ways that show anticipation. They were preparing for movements before the movements occurred. We see the same story reflected in the earliest evidence of pre-shaped cores. The convexities that make a flake predictable do not arise by accident. They require a sequence of removals whose only logic makes sense when viewed as preparation for a later single preferential strike. To create that geometry, a hominin had to hold the core in a position suited for removals that would not satisfy any immediate need. the value of the gesture lay in a future moment. This, arguably, is where the earliest forms of long-term foresight appear in the archaeological record. Not in grand decisions or deliberate strategies, but in something quieter, the way a hand braces a stone for what will happen later. A simple, practiced motion that carries the weight of the future. As these gestures accumulated across generations, they likely shaped neural circuitry as well. Studies on modern nappers show increased activation in parietal areas responsible for spatial prediction when holding a core in pre-strike configurations. Even before the first blow, the brain lights with expectation. If such neural patterns have deep evolutionary roots, then planning may have emerged first in these moments of stillness and alignment, when the mind rehearsed angles and the hand rehearsed stability. The first plans might not have been recognized as plans. They might have felt like pauses, like breaths before impact, like the hand waiting for the right moment to release force into stone. The realization we come to is that planning did not descend upon the human lineage suddenly or abstractly. It grew through repetition, through the slow training of hands that needed to stabilize a world before shaping it. In the earliest tools, the future was not conceptual. It was physical, held in the palm and prepared stroke by stroke. In those small rehearsals, the hand was learning something new, how to anticipate itself, and that anticipation would soon expand far beyond stone, guiding the species toward even deeper forms of foresight, and relationships shaped new ways of thinking. A hand once shaped for gripping bark in the half-light of an African morning is now wrapped around a stone. The fingers close with a new intention. The thumb presses in a direction that would have felt strange to ancestors, who still trusted their weight to branches. Something subtle changes inside the joints. Picture the moment not as a dramatic leap, but as a slow accumulation of tiny choices, repeated for tens of thousands of years, each one nudging anatomy toward a new balance between what the body once did easily and what it now struggled to master. When we talk about the rise of tools, we often speak of gains, precision, control, planning. Yet the fossil record preserves another story at the edges of bone surfaces and inside the tiny arcs of joints. It shows what was surrendered so that the hand could become the instrument of a new kind of life. The revelation is simple and quiet. Toolmaking demanded precision, and precision asked for sacrifice. Every anatomical shift toward controlled force created a vulnerability somewhere else. We see it in the straightening of fingers that once curled naturally around trunks, in the narrowing of joint surfaces that once supported the compressive loads of climbing, in the early appearance of degenerative patterns not present in our more arboreal relatives. The evidence does not come from a single fossil, but from a constellation of them, spread across hundreds of thousands of years. Each one is a clue about what the hand lost while learning to do something unprecedented. The information begins with curvature. In apes, the bones of the fingers arc gently, reinforcing them against the bending loads of suspensory locomotion. These arcs are not decorative. They distribute weight. They protect against shear. They ensure that when the body drops into a swing, the metacarpals and phalanges act as springs rather than brittle levers. Early hominins retained some of this curvature, but by the time we reach the genus Homo, the arcs begin to flatten. The fingers straighten, the shafts of the bones become less robust near the midsection, and more specialized for the kinds of compressive forces produced when gripping a core or a hammerstone. This realignment of the hand did not come without cost. A straighter finger is more vulnerable to torsional injury during unexpected twisting loads, less forgiving under impact if force arrives at an angle, and more prone to strain during arboreal movement. It is as if evolution began to close a door that had been open for tens of millions of years. Next comes the thumb. Much earlier segments explored its rise. but here the focus shifts to what the thumb lost. A long, powerful thumb is structurally valuable for precision grips, but it is also more exposed. The carpometacarpal joint at its base is a saddle, covered by cartilage that must withstand repeated high torque. Fossils show that as Homo species increased reliance on precision and forceful grips, the joint surfaces changed. They became more congruent. They provided greater stability, but they also wore down faster. Modern humans and Neanderthals alike show early onset degenerative changes at this joint, and in several Middle Pleistocene individuals we see remodelling patterns that suggest chronic overuse. The thumb gained strength and control at the price of resilience. It became the hero of fine motor manipulation and simultaneously its most fragile participant. The wrists tell another part of the story. Compared with apes, our wrists restrict certain lateral motions that once helped stabilize the hand during climbing. The ligaments thicken. The carpal bones reorganize to resist loads delivered along the axis of the forearm rather than those delivered during suspension. This shift made repeated striking with a hammerstone safer and more predictable. At the same time, it reduced our ability to distribute force through the wrist in the varied ways required for life in the canopy. The reduction in shear mobility can be seen not only in surface geometry, but in patterns of wear. In several fossil hominins, especially those from populations associated with habitual napping, arthritic changes accumulate along specific joint margins. These are not the broad degenerative patterns of age, but the localized signatures of repetitive activity. Another cost appears in the small joints between the phalanges. Repeated loading during toolmaking compresses cartilage, encourages osteophyte growth, and alters trabecular orientation inside the bone. The spongy inner lattice responds to the rhythm of life. When that rhythm involves percussion and carving rather than grasping branches, the orientation of struts follows suit. In Neanderthals, whose hands endured heavy loading from both tool production and hide working, the density of trabeculae in certain regions far exceeds that of earlier hominins. This strength is adaptive, but the boundaries around it reveal strain. Fractures, healed microcracks, and abnormal thickening mark the long-term toll taken by strain that was once unknown to our ancestors. We also traded reach for refinement. Shorter fingers, especially the reduction seen in the fifth digit relative to apes, narrowed the hand span. In a climbing context, this is a disadvantage. The capacity to grasp widely spaced holds, to engage the entire hand in a wrap grip, diminishes. What replaces it is stability in narrower, focused grips. The trade-off is visible anatomically, but its consequences can be inferred behaviourally. As climbing proficiency declined, terrestrial life took deeper root. Our ancestors became increasingly committed to the ground because their hands no longer excelled at the tasks the forest once required of them. A subtler sacrifice lies in what paleopathologists sometimes call the cost of directed force. The hands of habitual toolmakers show patterns of arthritis in the distal interphalangeal joints, especially in the index and middle finger. These are the same digits primarily responsible for stabilizing a core during flake removal. For individuals in the Middle Stone Age, these degenerative markers sometimes appear earlier than expected for their chronological age, suggesting overuse. The body adapted by thickening cortical bone, remodeling articular surfaces, and reinforcing ligament insertions. The price for these modifications was chronic pain, reduced range of motion, and vulnerability to long-term stiffness. Even the shift in the shoulder and upper limb, while beyond the strict boundary of the hand, contributes to the cost narrative. As arms became optimized for striking forward, with a downward blow controlled by the wrist, certain ancestral capacities for overhead suspension diminished. The glenoid cavity reshaped, the clavicle lengthened, and the scapula rotated differently across the ribs. These transitions are usually interpreted as gains, yet they also reduce the biomechanical efficiency of brachiation. The hand, by driving the evolution of the upper limb, restricted the body's capacity for an older lifestyle. Through this lens, the story of precision is not a triumphant march. It is a balancing act between what the hand could become and what it had to relinquish. Evolution does not grant advantages freely. It reallocates. Years of repeated tool tasks reshaped bone growth patterns, caused localized overuse injuries, and diminished the overall robustness needed for a life spent in trees. Our ancestors stepped away from the canopy, not because they lacked the will to climb, but because their hands were becoming something else. They were becoming instruments of foresight, precision, and planning. The price for that transformation was written into bone. And from those costs emerged the architecture of a new kind of existence. And the existence that emerged from these changes needed something more than strength. It needed cooperation. A hand moves before the brain has fully decided what the movement means. Fingers curl around a rough piece of stone, testing weight and balance, and for a moment the body behaves as if memory came before intention. Now picture the opposite. A mind forms a quiet plan long before the fingers act. Both scenarios are true in human evolution, and both were shaped by the same slow partnership that carried our lineage from the margins of African woodlands to every biome on the planet. There is a quiet argument, written across bone and cortex, that the brain did not simply command the hand. The brain grew to serve it. For a long time our story of brain evolution was told backwards. Narratives assumed that cognitive expansion arrived first and tools came later as clever consequences. But when researchers began mapping the increasing surface area of the somatosensory cortex, studying endocasts preserved in ancient sediment, and comparing them with the mechanical demands of stoneworking, a more patient and humbler picture emerged. The brain did not balloon in anticipation of symbolic reasoning. It expanded to manage the rising informational load delivered by fingertips pressing against stone, by wrists negotiating precise angles, and by thumbs that had begun to demand more neural territory than any other digit. The brain grew not because thought willed it, but because the hand required it. We do not know exactly when this partnership locked into place, but the evidence suggests that it unfolded gradually across hundreds of thousands of years as toolmaking began recruiting neural circuitry far beyond the motor strip. Every time an early napper tested the temperature of a stone with a quick tap, or traced the outline of a core to imagine where the next flake would travel, sensory pathways sent patterns of pressure, vibration, and microshock into cortical fields that had not been designed for this kind of precision. Over generations, these pathways were strengthened, then reorganized, until the very layout of the brain shifted. Quiet feedback loops between skin, muscle, and intention yielded new demands that the brain had to meet, or else the behavior could not stabilize. In this sense, the earlier stone toolmakers were not only shaping flakes, they were shaping the architecture of their descendants. We can see this in the expansion of somatosensory maps. In primates, the relative size of cortical tissue devoted to each body part mirrors functional need. In humans, the hand occupies an enormous portion of this map, rivaling even the tissue allocated to speech. But when fossil endocasts from early Homo species are compared to those of australopiths, there is evidence of an increasingly complex parietal region, where tactile feedback would later support not only manipulation but abstract reasoning. The regions that responded to pressure, friction, and slip became scaffolds for conceptual abilities, extending far beyond the realm of touch. It is possible, perhaps even likely, that what we now call symbolic thought grew out of the neural real estate first expanded by stoneworking. This is not speculation without grounding. Studies of modern nappers provide a small but illuminating window into ancient cognition. When experienced toolmakers reduce a core, functional MRI scans show coordinated activation not only in motor regions, but in areas associated with planning, episodic memory, and spatial reasoning. The cerebellum, traditionally viewed as a structure supporting balance and fine-tuned motion, lights up in patterns overlapping those seen in tasks involving grammar and logic. This suggests an ancient continuity, where the sequencing of strikes and the control of force provided a neural prototype for future forms of structured thought. When a napper prepared a platform for a single flake, they were practicing the same cognitive principles that would eventually allow humans to construct rules, narratives, and even mathematics. Even more telling is the forward modelling demanded by effective toolmaking. Human brains excel at prediction, but prediction is costly. It requires cognitive energy to simulate outcomes before they occur, to suppress immediate impulses, and to sustain attention across a sequence of actions. Stoneworking is one of the earliest documented behaviours requiring this level of foresight. A good hand axe demands that the maker imagine its symmetry before the first strike. A Levallois core requires an entire mental architecture of convexities and angles formed long before the preferential flake is released. This places heavy load on prefrontal regions that in other primates remain lightly used. The brain, in order to keep up, had to enlarge networks that could support long chains of imagined outcomes. The hand, by demanding precision and prediction, became one of the engines driving the growth of intelligence, but tactile feedback itself sculpted thought. The human fingertip contains thousands of mechanoreceptors sensitive to vibration frequencies that convey information about material properties. When early humans pressed a stone edge to test its sharpness, they were reading microtextures through patterns of neural firing that travelled rapidly to somatosensory cortex. This kind of sensory complexity required the brain to integrate fine tactile discrimination with stored knowledge of fracture mechanics and expected outcomes. Over time, these integrations supported more abstract associations. A certain vibration might indicate not only the current state of a stone, but the suitability of that stone for future tasks. In this way, sensory systems train the brain to think temporally and symbolically. The cerebellum also expanded in ways that hint at deep interdependence between motor precision and cognitive evolution. In endocasts from species dated to around 1 million years ago, the posterior cerebellar lobes show signs of growth relative to earlier hominins. These lobes today are involved in planning, language, and working memory. It is unlikely that early humans were speaking in forms recognizable to modern ears, but the expansion of these regions suggests that behaviors involving the sequencing of actions, the maintenance of goals, and the correction of errors through feedback were becoming central to survival. A hand striking stone again and again, listening for the right pitch, adjusting force, checking angles, was training a brain to become more efficient at any task requiring ordered reasoning. When archaeologists find clusters of finished flakes alongside partially prepared cores, they often interpret these sites as evidence of teaching or communal learning. Yet they also represent neural laboratories. Each iteration of a gesture strengthened synaptic pathways. Each corrected mistake pruned others away. Through these feedback cycles, entire circuits dedicated to precision were reinforced, passed down not genetically, but through patterns of behaviour that sculpted brain architecture in childhood. If a young hominin began learning toolmaking around the age when neuroplasticity was at its peak, the brain reorganized itself to meet the demands of those skills. In this sense, the hand built the mind twice. First, by selecting for neural expansion across evolutionary time, and again by shaping the developing brains of children, learning through imitation. but there is a subtler line of evidence suggesting that toolmaking contributed to the rise of symbolic cognition. The gestures of knapping require rhythm and pattern, a series of controlled strikes, a pause, a rotational adjustment, a new sequence. These patterns resemble the structure of early proto-language, not in sound but in organisation. Both involve ordered steps where each action depends on the one before. Some researchers propose that the same neural networks trained to manage these sequences in toolmaking may have later been recruited for symbolic expression. If true, this means that the mind capable of speaking may owe part of its structure to the hand capable of shaping stone. None of this means that the hand dictated the course of evolution alone. Climate change, dietary shifts, social complexity, and ecological pressures all contributed, but the anatomical and neurological record does suggest a deep entanglement. Hands did not simply carry out the commands of the brain. They provided the demands that shaped those commands. They offered the problems that the brain had to solve. They imposed constraints that encouraged neural innovation. In this sense, the earliest tools were not just objects. They were challenges posed by the world, answered through anatomy and cognition, acting together over vast stretches of time. By the time our species emerged, the partnership had become inseparable. The somatosensory cortex devoted to our hands was enormous. The parietal region supporting spatial reasoning had expanded. The prefrontal cortex managing planning and inhibition had matured into one of the most sophisticated biological systems on Earth. The cerebellum had grown into a silent architect of action and abstraction. And beneath it all was a simple reciprocal truth. Hands shaped brains, and brains shaped hands, until the boundary between them blurred into the identity we now call human. Perhaps this is why so many cultures later imagine creation beginning with a gesture, a hand moulding clay, a hand inscribing symbols, a hand reaching for another in the dark. Long before stories were told, long before symbols were carved, hands had already been carving the structure of the mind itself. The truth is quieter and older than myth. The intelligence we live with today is built upon the echo of stone struck against stone, and this entanglement, once begun, would carry us into new kinds of worlds. A moment so small it would not have disturbed the dust at anyone's feet. A moment when a hand closed around a stone with no intention other than to feel its weight. No prey in sight, no hunger pushing it, no danger demanding it. Just a hand, exploring the world that shaped it. Yet inside that touch lay the beginning of something that would reverse the direction of influence. For millions of years the hand had been sculpted by forests, by branches, by bark, by pressure, by gravity, by the demands of climbing and grasping and balancing. But with that single, quiet contact, a new sculptor entered the scene. The stone itself, through the behaviours it allowed and the movements it rewarded, began to shape the hand in return. We do not know for certain what triggered the first realignment of bone and tendon toward precision, but the fossil record shows that somewhere between 3 million and 2 million years ago, the trajectory of hand anatomy drifted away from what the rest of the primates maintained. The curvature of fingers flattened. The thumb grew more capable of resisting force. The carpal bones rearranged themselves into an architecture optimized not for swinging between branches, but for stabilizing directed impact. What the evidence suggests is that this was not merely adaptation to a new environment. It was adaptation to a new behavior that became a central part of survival. Everywhere we look, we see convergent traces of this shift. Muscle attachment sites enlarged where repeated precision grips demanded strength. Joint surfaces broadened where continuous shear required stability. Even the internal scaffolding of trabecular bone turned denser along the pathways of mechanical load introduced by shaping and striking stone. At first glance, the transformation seemed straightforward. Tools appeared, and anatomy followed. But the deeper we examine the record, the more circular the process becomes. Stone tools did not simply arrive fully formed one day and begin influencing skeletons. Their earliest beginnings required hands already endowed with a degree of control, sensitivity, and strength. Those hands in turn changed as the behaviour became habitual, generating bodies more suited to passing the skill onward. Skill transmission then rewarded individuals whose neural systems enabled imitation and planning. The anatomical alterations were not just physical responses to a new activity, they were part of a feedback loop in which behaviour and biology shaped each other in cycles spanning thousands of generations. Microscopic analysis of cortical bone reveals this sustained influence with striking clarity. If the activity had been occasional, the internal bone architecture would show little deviation from other primates. Instead, we see thickening along the proximal phalanges consistent with lifelong precision pinch grips. We see distinctive patterns of asymmetry in the metacarpals aligned with repeated unidirectional loading, something branch grasping does not produce. And in the most heavily used hands, we find early onset degenerative markers not of climbing, but of torsional stress from napping and prolonged fine manipulation. These alterations indicate that for many individuals the hand became a lifelong instrument used not for mobility or defence, but for shaping matter in increasingly deliberate ways. The body was reorganising itself around a behaviour. What the neurological evidence suggests is even more striking. When researchers compare the brain activation of modern nappers, learning Oldowan and Acheulean strategies, they find deep engagement of the prefrontal cortex and parietal regions responsible for representing space, sequencing actions, and integrating touch with prediction. These networks grow more efficient the more the skill is practiced. It is reasonable, therefore, to infer that in deep time, similar selective pressures favoured individuals whose neural systems produced smoother, more accurate sequences of hand movements. The resulting brains were not shaped by abstract thought first. They were shaped by repeated attempts to remove flakes from stone, each attempt refining the neural circuits that supported the gesture. The earliest cognitive scaffolding for symbolic thought did not begin with language or art. It began with practice, the slow, patient building of internal models that could guide the hand more precisely next time. This connection between hand and brain becomes even more apparent when we look at the somatosensory cortex. In humans, its map of the hand is vastly expanded compared to the same region in other primates. Entire fields of neurons exist solely to differentiate textures, pressures, and vibrations across the fingertips. Such expansion is not free. Neural real estate is metabolically expensive to maintain. The fact that our lineage invested so much into a detailed tactile map means that the informational return from that sensitivity must have been significant. The evidence suggests that as tools became more refined, individuals who could detect minute changes in edge angle, internal fracture planes, or the subtle give of an object under pressure were more successful at producing usable flakes. The brain rewarded the hand for improving, and the hand, by enabling more complex sequences, rewarded the brain with new cognitive territory to explore. Taken together, the fossil hands, the wear patterns, the joint surfaces, the neurological data, and the ethnographic studies of modern napping communities tell a coherent story. Humans did not simply use tools. They became shaped by the very behaviours they invented. This was not a single transition, but a self-amplifying system. The moment early hominins started engaging with stone in a sustained way, natural selection began reinforcing the anatomical traits that made the behaviour profitable. Those anatomical changes enabled more sophisticated techniques. The techniques demanded greater planning and sensitivity. The planning required changes to neural networks. The neural changes enabled cultural transmission, and cultural transmission increased the selective pressure to refine manual and cognitive abilities further. Each piece of the system supported all the others. By the time Homo sapiens emerged, the loop had transformed not only the hand but the nature of human culture itself. The hand had become a medium through which knowledge flowed across generations, its shape encoding a history of behaviours that reached far beyond any individual's life. The brain had become organised around a fine motor world in which prediction, sequencing, and teamwork were essential. Even the broader patterns of social organisation were tied to this entanglement. Cooperative tool production required stable teaching environments. Stable environments required groups willing to share resources. Resource sharing required long-term social commitments. The hand, then, was not only reshaped by stone, it helped reshape society. When seen from this perspective, the statement that humans made tools becomes only the most superficial layer of the truth. The deeper truth is that tools made humans. Our anatomy is not the neutral backdrop against which culture emerged. It is the product of millions of years of bodily negotiation with matter. Every ridge of the thumb's saddle joint, every nerve ending in the fingertip, every ligament stabilizing the wrist, every expansion in the somatosensory cortex tells us that the lineage leading to Homo sapiens continually fed behavior back into biology. We became the species that rewired its own body through repetition. We became the species that built its mind through practice. And once those loops were established, there was no clear boundary left between the anatomy we inherited and the anatomy we invented. It is humbling to realize that the earliest architects of human cognition were not abstract ideas or linguistic breakthroughs, but the subtle adjustments of bone responding to pressure and movement across countless lives. The origins of planning lie not in sudden leaps of insight, but in small corrections repeated until they transform the scaffold on which thought would later rest. Our species' extraordinary neural capacities grew upward from foundations laid by hands that refused to stop experimenting with the world. And so, when we ask what the first technology was, the evidence suggests a surprising answer. Before any blade, before any spear, before any fire-hardened point, the first technology was the hand itself, a living structure that adapted to the tasks it undertook, and in doing so made new forms of thought possible. The hand was not simply a tool, it was the evolving interface through which a species shaped itself, and somewhere in deep time, a stone changed a hand, and that hand changed a world.